Hi everyone, and welcome to lesson 3 of our Fate and Destiny series of Romeo and Juliet. This lesson I will be taking you through how to actually write the response of the big question, which is worth 25 marks. There we have Romeo, saying, "Well, Juliet, I will lie with thee tonight," of course defying the stars, which is what we looked at last lesson. And speaking about that, just make sure that before this lesson that you've actually completed lessons 1 and 2. Have your Romeo and Juliet text with you, but you should also have key quotes to help you write the response. But do remember that in the exam, which is way away for you at the moment, is that you will have to revise those quotes and know key quotes out of the text. But for now, you can actually use your Romeo and Juliet text, or you might already have your set quotes. Thank you to those of you who have sent me your work already. There's some superb work coming through there. Very well prepared. Well done. Okay, just to start us off then, I would like to start off just testing you on the quotations that I gave you. I think it was lesson 1. So I'm going to go through each one. I want you to write down which act you think it's from and who actually says it. If you can't say which act and scene it is, you can actually refer to what part of the play it is. That's fine. And in an essay, you can do that as well. You can actually refer. So for instance, in the ball scene or the balcony scene, that is okay if you don't remember what particular act and scene it comes from. Let's go. From forth the fatal loins of these two foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life. Second one. Some consequence, yet hanging in the stars. 3. A plague on both your houses. 4. Oh, I am fortune's fool. 'I have an ill-divining soul, methinks I see thee dead in the bottom of a tomb.' O fortune, fortune, be fickle, fortune. Is it e'en so? Then I defy you, stars. Unhappy fortune, and shake the yoke of inauspicious stars. And finally, a greater power than we can contradict have thwarted our intents. So you can put me on pause here, because what I'm now going to do any second now is I'm going to go to the next slide and I'm actually going to reveal which act and scene and which character actually says it or where it's from. Okay, but remember, you can put me on pause if you really want to kind of go through these yourselves and take your time to go through them. There's no rush. Alright, so the first one, from forth the fatal loins of these two foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life. That's the prologue. Always use the prologue in every essay that you do on Romeo and Juliet, and I think I did say that last lesson. Some consequence yet hanging in the stars. That's Romeo, and that's Act 1, Scene 4, and that's just before he goes to the ball. A plague on both your houses is Mercutio, Act 3, Scene 1. That's the big fight scene, the climax of the play. Oh, I am fortune's fool. That's Romeo, Act 3, Scene 1, after the fight scene. I have an ill-divining soul, methinks I see thee dead in the bottom of a tomb. That's Juliet, Act 3, Scene 5. O fortune, fortune, be fickle, fortune. That's Juliet, Act 3, Scene 5. Is it e'en so? Then I defy you, stars. Romeo, Act 5, Scene 1. Unhappy fortune. That's Friar Lawrence, Act 5, Scene 2. And shake the yoke of inauspicious stars. That's Romeo, Act 5, Scene 3. And a greater power than we can contradict have thwarted our intents. And that's Friar Lawrence in Act 5, Scene 3, right at the end of the play. Also as well, I think I did say this last lesson, but have a go at finding your own quotations and evidence. You're more likely to remember those, the one you find yourself and the ones you investigate yourselves, rather than trying to remember ones maybe that I've given you, but don't dismiss ones that I've given you, because these are what you would call key quotes for fate and destiny. All right, so just to return to this, we've got Fate and Destiny in Romeo and Juliet, and we are learning, as always, with AO2 to analyse the writer's use of language and structure. Band 3, remember it's the top 3 bands that I'm doing with you. Notice here that I put 7 to 9 marks in the band 3, but you are doing the 25 mark question. This one is for the 15 mark question, but that's fine because the bandings are exactly the same in terms of criteria. So in band 3 then, we would expect you to be able to comment and begin to analyse writers' use of language, form and structure using relevant subject terminology. So just beginning to do it and making the odd comment about it. Band 4, I can discuss and increasingly analyse writers' use of language, form and structure and use apt subject terminology, so appropriate subject terminology that is directly linked to that particular device that Shakespeare's using, or language or structure. And then, you know, increasing your analysis, building it up as you go and being able to discuss as well what that language is and what Shakespeare is trying to do here. And then band 5, to analyse and appreciate writers' use of language, form and structure, explore and evaluate the way meaning and ideas are conveyed and use precise subject terminology in an appropriate context. So again, it's making those links, but really being able to think about why Shakespeare uses that particular device and discussing it at length, or maybe evaluating it or how he's doing it. You know, what are the writer's intentions? And remember, this is a play. We are supposed to be watching it, not reading it. So you always answer the question as though we're actually watching it as an audience member. It's a play with an audience, okay? That word here about appreciating writers' use of language, form and structure, it's a little bit like in the poetry when you think of a different perspective or you come up with your own ideas. I think it's really taking it that bit further, you know, exactly what is it about Shakespeare? What was he trying to get across to his audience here? Okay, but I'm going to show you something this lesson to show how you can appreciate what he was actually doing. All right, just to recap here, we've got the themes that we talked about the last 2 lessons. And again, what I've done is I've just highlighted the idea of fate because that's what we're doing our lessons on. And as you can see here on the right hand side, right at the bottom is the question that we are going to be doing today. So how does Shakespeare present fate and destiny in Romeo and Juliet? Refer to characters and events from the play in your answer. Notice there that it's not asking you about how the audience reacts to this. That was the first part of the question. And the first part of the question, which is worth 15 marks, is an actual close analysis of the extract. This time what you're going to be doing is thinking about the play as a whole and thinking about that theme of fate and destiny. And remember, in the exam, that second question, the 25 mark question, may not be related to the first question, which is worth 15 marks. But I have, for the purpose of this lesson, actually connected them. Okay, but just remember that 5 of this question's marks are allocated for accuracy in spelling, punctuation, and the use of vocabulary and sentence structures. So you spag. Okay, everyone, what I want to show you now is I want to show you how it would be marked in the exam. So I've simplified it just to make it more like student speak, to make it make sense. And there's 2 things that we're going to look at here, and it's AO1, so the ability to track the text and the ability to use evidence and to show an understanding, and your AO2 is your analysis of language and structure. Notice how there's no context here, and I did say that last lesson. You won't be expected to talk deeply about context, though you will say some of it because we can't help it when we talk about plays like Romeo and Juliet, because Shakespeare was heavily influenced by the society in which he was living. Okay, so AO1, what would they expect to see in your answer? Now, remember, this is not, you know, track by track, doing it in order. This is a guide, and this is what an examiner would look for in a really, really good piece of writing about the play. Okay, so AO1, let's go back. So we've got here, you've got to really show an overview of the presentation of the theme of fate in the play. So you've got to really tell us a little bit about what fate would be. If you want to use my voice here while you're writing the essay and just doing a quick plan, that might actually help. You don't have to do that, that's fine, but it might be worthwhile, or maybe using this as a checklist to check that you've actually put these things in your response. And again, it doesn't have to be in any particular order, though I would actually suggest that you do talk about fate right at the beginning though of your response. They'd expect to see in your response comments on the different forms of fate and destiny presented in the play. For example, the prologue, dreams, stars and fortune. So all those different aspects that we looked at in lesson 1, and about how, you don't just say fate is about how it's perceived, how we're going to end our life. It's not just about that in the play. There's different ways of looking at how they thought they were destined to be. So don't just zoom in on one aspect, look at different aspects of it, or different elements of it. The strength of Romeo and Juliet's passion and its consequences for them and those around them. This idea that, this will always run through the play. The fact that their love is so great for each other, and you could argue it's quite unrealistic really, but we need to forget about that, because people in Elizabethan time needed a bit of romance in their lives and a bit of excitement. But it's the idea that their passion is so great for each other, and they both do have premonitions that this is going to end badly, but they choose to ignore them. And of course, it has its consequences. The comments of various characters that link with fate and destiny. For example, you wouldn't just talk about Romeo and Juliet. You might talk about Mercutio and the fact that he puts the curse on the families. And that is that does change the path of, where Romeo and Juliet were going. Don't forget, they were married at this point, and everything was planned out, ready for them to be revealed to the families when the time was right. It was so straightforward until this fight scene. This was the climax of the play. The climax of a story, we all know this now, that it's the turning point of the story, and it's where things start to go downhill. The nurse's comments about the marriage to Paris, you might mention that if you want to. This idea that, she got in the way, didn't she? Because she kind of realised that they're going to have to get out of this, because she knows, she knew, and the friar knew, that what they've done is actually wrong against the families. So she tries to find the easy way out and says to Juliet, why don't you just marry Paris? Forget about Romeo. Well, of course, Juliet doesn't want to do that. And here what I'd say to you is, if you really do want to talk about other characters, go back to lesson 1 where we looked at those characters and I gave you an overview of how each character does link in some way with fate and destiny. In AO2, you've got things, what we're looking for. Now, it might look here like we're crossing over. I'm actually repeating things I've said already. That is fine. But look here, they're looking for you to look at key exchanges. So this is also to do with the structure of the play. So the way that the play is put together. So how does Shakespeare use these key exchanges? So the things they say to each other. The idea of certain speeches that are made, the idea of certain soliloquies that are made, especially with Romeo and Juliet. Where are they in the play, and how is it effective when it comes to, or how do they link to the idea of fate and destiny? And thinking of things like the prologue, Romeo's premonition in Act 1, Scene 4 before the ball, and then Friar Lawrence at the end of the play when he realises that, there's nothing greater than fate, something got a greater power over these people. Make sure, and it goes without saying with AO2, is that you comment on Shakespeare's use of language in the presentation of fate and destiny. Use your exploded quotes here. So I've seen some really, really good work. You've sent it in, and fantastic. Those people that are sending that really, really good work in, you will not regret this, everyone, because come next year, you'll be experts at this. So use your exploded quotes, all the prep work that I've done with you. Don't just start doing the essay. Don't just start doing the response without using the stuff that you've had in lesson 1 and 2. That will really prepare you for what you want to say. So please do not ignore language analysis in the big essay. It's so easy to do that because you want to write about what happens in the play. So please be careful of that. Comment on the use of imagery and language devices. So again, that's very similar to the language I've just said to you about. But for instance, Shakespeare might use oxymoron to show confusion. I'm not saying that that's going to happen in your response. There might not be anything there that you can use, especially with an oxymoron. There will be other devices there. But imagery, things like the plague, what do we imagine when he uses that word, Mercutio, and he says a plague on both your houses? He is cursing the families, and we do know that a curse said 3 times of a dying man is going to bring, this terrible, terrible fate to these families. But think about the idea of what does plague actually mean? What are the connotations of plague? You know, the idea of rotting away, decaying, you know, really, you've really got to get into that language and the imagery that Shakespeare uses. And then comments on how Shakespeare's use of form contributes to his presentation of fate. For example, where he uses soliloquies, you know, why is he using soliloquy? It's the, you know, it's the character who speaks out loud to the audience. You know, are there any use of sonnets in there? Now that's obviously to do with the theme of love in the play, but don't forget fate and destiny is also about love as well. And then this idea and appreciation of structure through the identification of key moments and events in Shakespeare's presentation of fate. And that goes back to really kind of looking at key exchanges, looking at an overview and tracking the play from the beginning to the end. You cannot include every single thing that Shakespeare does, but if you show that you are tracking the text and tracking the play, then that shows that you are following how Shakespeare structures it. And don't forget, it's very much like the story mountain. You know, the climax right at the peak of the mountain, that is how Shakespeare does it. He does it in 5 parts or 5 acts. Okay, so it is a very simple structure, but if you're tracking it, it shows that you're following that structure. One thing I did say before to you was about this idea of appreciation of Shakespeare's language and what Shakespeare's trying to do to get into that band 5. Now, I'm not saying that you should use this in your response. This is more of a critique. This is what someone's put together. Now, I have stolen this. I read it. I can't remember where I got it from, but I found it really, really interesting. So I thought I would share it with you. Right, so let's have a look at this then. So it says, through the irony of Romeo's defiance. Now, this is referring to the bit where Romeo says, I defy you, stars. So he takes events into his own control, or so he thinks. So here, through the irony of Romeo's defiance rebounding upon himself, Shakespeare demonstrates the extreme power of fate. So remember what happens to Romeo and Juliet in the end. Nothing can stand in its way. All factors swing in its favour. The outbreak of the plague, remember when Friar John was taking the letter, and we don't see that in any film version, but in the play itself, when Friar John goes to take the letter, there's an outbreak of the plague, so he has to go for shelter, he has to protect himself and shut himself away in quarantine. So of course the letter doesn't get there. The idea that Balthazar gets the wrong information, he chooses what to see. He sees Juliet's body being taken into the tomb, so of course he's going to think that she's dead. Why wouldn't you think that? So the message that he gives of Juliet's death, and also Capulet's decision to move Juliet's wedding date as well, and also decide when Juliet was going to get married. But the fact that he says it's going to be on Thursday almost straight away, this is what, 1 or 2 days later, that is not giving the time for, you know, Friar John to get to Romeo without any mishaps. And of course there's a mishap. There you go. Fate is also attached to the social institutions of the world in which Romeo and Juliet live. This destiny, brought about by the interplay of societal norms from which Romeo and Juliet cannot escape, seems equally powerful though less divine. In other words, they have to behave in a certain way. This idea of his patriarchal society, Juliet should behave in the way that her father says. The two of them are ignoring this. And, okay, you might argue and say that there's something greater going on here, but these two are actually making these choices as well. It's a fate created by man and man's inability to see through the absurdity of the world he's created. So this idea, they are going to love each other no matter what. It might be a patriarchal society. The idea that Romeo should not be marrying into an enemy family, as the heir of the Montagues as well. So what they do, they go against all this. And then in Act 5, Scene 1, we then see Romeo as that agent of his own fate. Then he has taken it into his own hands. And there are consequences to that. The fortune that befalls Romeo and Juliet is internal rather than external. It's determined by the natures and choices of its two protagonists. And I just said that before, the way that they behave and the way they are. Were Romeo not so rash and emotional, so quick to fall into melancholy, the double suicide would not have occurred. Had Juliet felt it possible to explain the truth to her parents, the double suicide might not have occurred. But to wish someone were not as they were is to wish the impossible. Sometimes we behave the way we want to behave, don't we? And also, hindsight is a beautiful thing. This idea that the two of them do behave in this way, again, I'm going to keep coming back to this, but that band 5, when that talks about the appreciation of what Shakespeare's trying to do here, always ask yourself, if they hadn't done this, what might have happened? That is really thinking on a higher level. And that's not to say that I do not want you to move away from the question too much, but you do really need to be thinking about those things and asking questions of the text, which is what an audience member would do anyway. You do it all the time when you watch something, you ask questions of it. And then the love between Romeo and Juliet exists precisely because they are who they are. The destructive, suicidal nature of their love is just as much an aspect of their natures as individuals and a couple. Okay, so what we're going to do is, I gave you this last lesson, and some of you did it, some of you didn't, and that's fine. It was an option. So I gave you a waggle as to terms of what the extract question would look like, and it was only a little bit really. And notice how close it is, you know, in terms of choosing your quotations, really pulling out the language, really thinking about what the audience is thinking here, thinking about technique. You can't really do this with the big question because you haven't got time, and you are looking at the big picture, you're looking at the whole text, so you can't include everything, not to this extent, but you can still analyse the language as you go. Okay, so very, very quickly with this one, just remind you, you don't have to listen to me here. You can actually put me on pause, or you can just skip ahead if you want to. So in this extract, Balthazar brings the news of Juliet's death to Romeo. The audience is aware of Friar Lawrence's letter that informs Romeo of the plan, but the young lover has had no such news. However, at the beginning of the extract, notice how we're talking about extract here because that's what the actual question asks you. Before Balthazar arrives, Romeo in his soliloquy is in an unaccustomed spirit. He thinks, my dreams presage some joyful news at hand. The idea of him dreaming this suggests that he wants this to be true. After all, sleep tells the truth. This is a contrast to earlier in the play when he dreamt of some vile forfeit of untimely death, which shows that he chooses what to believe. Now, I did say to you last lesson, I wouldn't normally do that with an extract question, link back to something else. I would just actually focus on the extract, but I really felt it was a great opportunity to say something here. The reason why I'm telling you this is because the next bit I'm going to show you, I do actually use this for the big picture, for the big response. His fickle character is perhaps highlighted here when he talks about presage, which being an omen often indicated bad things, yet it is joyful to him. The use of juxtaposition could reinforce Romeo's puzzlement and confusion. He has had no news, and anything that guides him to something hopeful is better than the isolation he must be feeling right now. The audience further sees that Romeo, as usual, is also guided by his heart, my bosom's lord. And again, you can see the detail that I've gone into there of the extract, slightly different with the bigger response. So have a look at this next slide and I'll show you what I mean. All right, I've just taken here elements of the waggle, and I've actually just taken it as if I was answering the big response. Now, I wouldn't start with this. I wouldn't start with this bit, Act 5, Scene 1. You know that, because that's further on in the play. It's near the end of the play. I would build up to this towards the end. Let's have a quick look at how I've done it, and I've changed it into the bigger response. So I'm not ignoring the information that I've already got. Okay. In Act 5, Scene 1, Balthazar brings the news of Juliet's death to Romeo. The audience is aware of Friar Lawrence's letter that informs Romeo of the plan, but the young lover has had no such news. However, at the beginning of the scene, before Balthazar arrives, Romeo in his soliloquy is in an unaccustomed spirit. He thinks, my dreams presage some joyful news at hand. The idea of him dreaming this suggests that he wants this to be true. After all, sleep tells the truth. The fact that Shakespeare uses juxtaposition here would reinforce the idea that Romeo is puzzled by the dream, as presage and omen and joyful do not normally belong together. There is still something unsettling here. Perhaps it is fate playing its part. This soliloquy is in contrast to earlier in the play, Before the Ball, when he dreamt some vile forfeit of untimely death, which shows that he chooses what to believe, but in that dream there was something vile, almost unspeakable, and that he would pay the price when he talks of forfeit. Okay, let me just tell you what I've done with the colours here. So the red is the evidence. Okay, when I've said use the green, what I've done here is I've tried to show you how I'm looking at structure, and I'm trying to put it into the picture really about how Shakespeare is doing this. But you need to make it clear that you know as well how we got to this point. Okay, so how did we get to this point where Romeo's waiting for Balthazar to arrive with some news? You need to put that in some sort of context, okay? And again, you can see further down I've written before the ball. So even if you don't remember what the scene and what the act is, you can actually refer to that in an exam situation. But for now, because you've got the detail in front of you, use the acts and scenes just to get used to it if you can. Also, what I've done here, you can see in the purple, I've actually used subject terminology and I've actually explained why it's used. And then in the blue, I've shown a contrast. So what I'm doing here is, and again, this is how you get into band 4 and 5, you try to link those ideas together. So you really are thinking about how Shakespeare structures his play. So everything is linked. Everything goes back to the prologue. Everything reminds the audience about, how these two are star-crossed. They're not meant to be together. But do that if you can. Really start to link those ideas together. Link back to what has happened already. The audience is reminded here about what happened in Act 1, Scene 2, for example. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm not going to give you a whole waggle for this. I've just done that with that part of the play. But what I will do, if you really are struggling to know what to say and how to structure it, then I've given you some ideas here that you can actually use. So I put the question at the top. So there's your question again. So how does Shakespeare present fate and destiny in Romeo and Juliet? And refer to characters and events from the play in your answer. It says how to begin your ideas and some useful phrases. Remember though, you can't do everything. Just track the play to show how Shakespeare presents fate. Keep analysing language and technique. And what I would say to you as well, year 10, is take your time with this. Do it in stages. There's a reason why I'm giving you a week to do this. Okay, please don't just think you can just do it all in one. Yes, you can. Of course you can. But I would like you really to think about the advice that I've given you. Those ones that I gave in your analysis on the poems, which were very, very good. I've given each of you personalised comments and what you need to do next time. So okay, it is for poetry, but it's also about language and technique as well. So please take your time with this and go through it bit by bit. I'd rather you knew it rather than rush ahead and then skip through loads of things that you could have said. Because don't forget, by the time you get to year 11, your knowledge will be double. Okay, if you can actually look at the real detail now, by the time you get to year 11, it'll be much easier for you to apply that then. So let's have a look at the type of things that I've done. So I would start off and I would say something like this. Fate is a major theme in the play Romeo and Juliet, as audiences in Elizabethan times very much believed that your life was determined by fortune and what lay in the stars. Shakespeare presents this idea through the characters' beliefs, dialogue and actions. Always do that in a response, because it shows that you understand that this is a play that we're watching. And I did say to you, it isn't about context. We're not testing you on that, but sometimes you can't avoid saying it because Shakespeare is very much influenced by what his audience wanted, and he knew how his audience thought as well. So you can't really get away with that with Shakespeare. Okay, so again, I'm doing an overview here. What does it mean about fate? And remember, go back to that checklist that I gave you that the examination board gives us to show what to look for in a response. Okay, so go back and use that as your checklist, and use this as well if you want to. I would then go on and I would say something like in the prologue, so always start with the prologue, we're informed that. So I would pick out maybe one quote, one really, really strong quote, like star-crossed lovers. There might be a better one that you could use there, and analyse it. Analyse the language. Okay, what is it about stars? Why was it crossed? Use those different things. Keep analysing as you go. Okay. Then I might go on. Now, what you need to avoid here is when you're writing it, and I'm not saying this is wrong to do this because some students prefer to do this. What you sometimes find in this type of essays, a student will say, in the prologue, this happens, and Shakespeare uses this, and this is suggested by this. In Act 1, Scene 2, this is the thingy. Then in Act 1, 3, Scene 3, it just becomes a little bit repetitive, and it doesn't really give you that scope for analysing and linking and going back and really thinking about the whole play together. Okay, so this is what I've done instead. But what I've done as well, I've just shown you at the end whereabouts these are in the play. I've not actually said it in my answer, but just so you can see that I'm actually tracking the play itself and not including every single thing that I need to. So I've said here, as this is a play which deals with the passion between the star-crossed lovers, it also shows that there are consequences in denying your fate. For instance, Romeo, before the ball, says, and then off I go. I would get my quote and I'd start to talk about the techniques and analyse that. We also need to consider that Shakespeare moves the action forward really quickly. So I'm talking about structure here, which leads to disastrous consequences as rash decisions are made by both lovers. And I'm referring there to Act 2 because the idea of the balcony scene, that happens really quickly. You know, they get married. It all happens in Act 2, doesn't it? In such a short space of time. So really you do need to be thinking about that because these two are not meant to be together in the first place. Okay. Then I would talk about, you know, I'd keep moving it on. I'd want to sort of move towards Act 3, Scene 1, which is a really, really important scene. So the secret marriage leads the action into the climax of the play. Remember this, everyone. The fact is, the reason why Romeo shows up that day is not to fight Tybalt. He knows that Tybalt wants to challenge him to a duel, which is only right and what we expected. That's a norm in that society. That's what I said before. These two lovers go against societal norms. Okay, so what he's done is he's turned up and he's going to refuse to fight Tybalt. And as a result of that, Mercutio, of course, gets angry. It's a typical male in that time. And then, of course, it all goes wrong at that point. So I'll just read through that again. The secret marriage leads the action into the climax of the play when Mercutio, as a result of Romeo's actions, is slain by Tybalt. He, of course, curses the family. You could say 3 times here if you want to, in the idea of a dying man. And then he says a plague on both your houses. And again, you can actually pull that apart and you can say something about that and why that's a turning point in the play. So you could actually get in that bit of your response. You could talk about structure and you could talk about language as well in that one bit of your essay. Then I would move on and I'd start thinking, okay, well, I've mentioned Romeo quite a bit here about his premonitions, and I might think, you know what, I'm going to say something here about Juliet, because don't forget, she's there, isn't she? She's waiting for Romeo. She's there in the background, and then all of a sudden, everything just goes wrong for her. So Juliet is the more sensible character out of the two, refers to fortune and premonitions in the play, and she does that in Act 3, Scene 5, and go back to the quotes that we did at the beginning and think about what she means here. And if you've exploded these quotes yourselves, then you'll be able to just transfer those and put them into your response. Don't make it hard for yourselves, everyone. Another turning point in the play is when Juliet is forced to fake her own death in order to change the fate of the pair. Perhaps here Shakespeare is suggesting that they are punished by defying fortune. For instance, everything is stacked against them. Friar John, when taking the letter to Romeo, is forced to take refuge from the plague, and Balthazar gives Romeo false news. And again, that's, you know, that's your Act 4 going into Act 5, and you could just pick out a couple of quotes there. And then finally, we're taken on this fearful passage, that's from the prologue, to the ending of the play, and Friar Lawrence, as a religious man, admits that. And he talks about this, that this greater power have thwarted our intentions. You know, we did mean well, but fate was dealing us a greater blow. So I think the idea is you start with the prologue if you can, and then you would end with the last scene, because it does definitely come in with the last scene here. So you're tracking the play and you're not including every single thing. Now there's just one thing to say here. The way that I have written this is they're just ideas. You have to fill it in with language. You have to fill it in with technique that's used by Shakespeare. If you left it like this, that is just really narrating the story. That is just retelling it. Now, I have analysed it a little bit here without using too much language, which will probably get me about band 3. But as soon as you start getting language into it, as soon as you start analysing it really, really well and more sustained, that will get you into your band 4, band 5, okay? But just by narrating the story, which is even simpler than what you've got in front of you here, if you just narrated the story and just told us what happened, that wouldn't get you any more than band 2, Okay, so please remember that evidence, that analysis, to get you into those higher bands. Okay everyone, so that's it really from me. And what I'd like to say is obviously good luck. I look forward to seeing these responses. I really enjoyed reading the nature poetry. And there's just one final slide that I'm going to give to you, because I know that some of you are doing this work quite quickly. And I would say to you though, please don't rush it. Please take your time with it. It really is worth getting that feedback just to show how you can actually improve things. But if you really do want to extend your ideas here, it's not so much to do with analysing the play, it's this. The next thing that we're going to go on to is we're going to be looking at speech writing. So I think it might be a nice idea for you to do this, but please don't do this if you haven't got time and you'd rather concentrate on Romeo and Juliet. That is fine. It's just something that I'm putting in here. So it says, create a persuasive speech arguing either for Romeo and Juliet dealing with Elizabethan beliefs about stars and fate, or for it being a message that people have control of their own destiny and should consider their actions more wisely. So when I say here Romeo and Juliet, I mean the play itself. Is Shakespeare, is it dealing with Elizabethan beliefs about stars and fate, or is it a message that really, no, you're not. You're in control of your own destiny. Whatever happens is your own fault. You do. Okay, look at slide 7 again and have a look and see any ideas you can get there. But you know what? Challenge, consider other points of view, but explain why you're still right. It might be something good for you to think about. It's good practice for Romeo and Juliet, but it's also good practice for your persuasive writing as well. And you can see there at the bottom, AO4, use a range of vocabulary and sentence structures for clarity, purpose and effect with accurate spelling and punctuation. That is all to do with your writing, okay? And we are going to be moving on to speeches after this unit is done. Okay everyone, that's it from me. So again, like I said before, good luck and I will speak to you soon.